Are you certain this is a good idea, Krivax? I don't see the problem, Masrook. We were able to verify that the letter genuinely came from Stormwind's leaders. The magic contained in the letter's emblem was impossible to fake. That does not mean that this is not a trap. This all seems incredibly suspicious. Weren't you the one who was complaining that Capital City suddenly became too boring after the soldiers went off to war and that you had nobody to spar with? I thought that you'd be glad for the chance to fight off potential assassins. Your argument is compelling. Krivax snorted in amusement and turned his attention back to the nondescript building that the two of them were approaching. He could feel that the building had several protective wards that would alert the occupants when someone was approaching, but the wards felt as if they had been put up fairly recently. It gave Krivax a sense that this location had been prepared just for this meeting and had not been actively used for a significant period of time. It took quite a bit of effort for Krivax and Masrook to discreetly arrive at the meeting location specified in the letter that he had received from Stormwind, but he eventually managed to do so. After receiving a letter that was requesting that he meet privately with a few of Stormwind's representatives to discuss an important matter that affected both them and Azjol-Nerub, Krivax had been extremely curious about what they wanted to talk about. Of course, he didn't hesitate to present the letter to Hadix, but the vizier was too busy with his own affairs to really pay it much mind. He simply instructed Krivax to bring along someone for protection and reminded him to use his magical emergency device if he needed to call for help. Unfortunately, trying to secretly make your way to a clandestine meeting as a giant spider person was not a simple matter, but it was nothing that sufficient amounts of magic couldn't solve. It helped a bit that the designated meeting location was in a poorer part of the city. Most of the residents went out of their way not to concern themselves with what other people were doing, which meant that the magic hiding their presence was significantly easier to maintain. What now? Asked Masrook, bringing Krivax's attention back to the matter at hand. I suppose we just knock on the door, Krivax said hesitantly. It wasn't like the letter had included any secret passcodes for them to use once they reached their destination. Krivax walked through the ward and moved to do just that, only to be interrupted when the door opened up slightly before he could knock, allowing a wary half-elf man to peek through and glance between him and Masrook. Good morning, said Krivax, keeping his tone friendly. I believe that we are expected. Given how distinctive the two of them were, Krivax didn't feel any need to verify their identities. The man only hesitated for a moment before opening the door fully and gesturing them both inside. Krivax moved to go inside, but Masrook insisted on entering first, staring suspiciously at the half-elf the entire time and nodding to Krivax after he saw nothing out of place. After Krivax ducked down through the doorway and skittered inside, the half-elf closed and locked the door before turning to face them. Good morning, Vizier Krivax. My name is Devon Everdawn, said the half-elf as he began to walk off deeper into the building. Krivax moved to follow him after only a moment. I apologize for the rush, but we have a limited amount of time before our absence is noted by certain parties. Krivax and Masrook followed the man without comment as they were led to a room that looked as if it was the office of some noble. There were only two people in the room, one who Krivax found unfamiliar and one who he recognized in an instant. The former was an old woman with a severe expression who was wearing several large gaudy rings on her fingers, and the latter was the Crown Prince of Stormwind himself, Varian Wrynn. The 15-year-old boy was obviously doing his best to appear serious and regal while sitting behind a desk and was admittedly doing a better job than Krivax would have expected, likely as a result of his training and upbringing. The only glimpses that Krivax had previously had of the kid were when he was looking miserable, but Varian did a good job of cleaning himself up. Welcome, Vizier Krivax. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, said Varian as they entered the room. Devon Everdawn moved to stand behind his prince while Krivax made their way to the cushions that had been prepared for him and Masrook stood to the side. Krivax was glad for the consideration. It always made him feel awkward to loom over people that were so much smaller than him. As you likely well know, I am Varian Wrynn, Crown Prince of Stormwind. With me are Pathonia Shaw and Devon Everdawn, two members of Stormwind's intelligence service, SI-7. Krivax glanced at the old woman in surprise once he heard her name. The only Shaw that he was familiar with was Matthias Shaw, who had been the leader of SI-7 and spymaster of Stormwind for most of the canon timeline. Is this woman his grandmother? Devon Everdawn was someone who was completely unfamiliar to him, so Krivax assumed him to just be some kind of nameless spy. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Prince Rin," said Krivax, bowing slightly. "I confess, I'm very curious as to why you've called for this meeting. Especially when the only participants are two intelligence agents and you seem to be without a guard." "Just because you haven't seen a guard, does not mean that one doesn't exist," said Pythonia Shaw, her lips curling up into a smirk. "I promise you, Nerubian, our crown prince is more protected than he seems." Krivax hummed in consideration before glancing at Masrook, who nodded in affirmation. The people of this world were capable of a supernatural degree of stealth if they trained for it or used enchanted items, and Masrook had always been a tad more observant of his surroundings than Krivax. "She speaks the truth. I noticed a few of their guards as we were passing through the hallways," said Masrook. "Humph. You have good eyes, lad. Although it's probably cheating when you have 8 of them. To answer your question, Vizier, I asked you here to discuss a matter that affects both Stormwind and Azjol-Nerub," said Prince Rin, continuing the conversation as if Pythonia and Masrook hadn't spoken. "Specifically, I wish to make you aware of a threat to both of our kingdoms." "And what threat is that, Your Highness?" asked Krivax. He had a suspicion about what Prince Rin was referring to, but he wanted to hear it from him first. "I'm referring to the forces responsible for manipulating the nobles of Lordaeron into not sending aid to my kingdom in its hour of greatest need," said Prince Rin, a thread of anger and hatred slipping into his tone. "The same force which I have reason to believe is attempting to turn public opinion against Azjol-Nerub." Krivax was suddenly very glad that the humans had no way to understand Nerubian facial expressions. Even if he'd already had suspicions, the prince's words still surprised him. "How did they manage to catch on to Deathwing? I don't remember anything like that happening in the canon lore." "That's a strong claim. Do you have any evidence for this?" Krivax asked in an attempt to acquire more information. He needed to figure out how much they knew. The prince nodded before turning to Pythonia Shaw. "After Stormwind's destruction, we immediately grew suspicious as to why none of the other kingdoms had sent us aid, despite our repeated pleas for assistance," Shaw explained before gesturing to the half-elf standing beside her. "Devon Everdawn had skills uniquely suited for finding the truth of this matter, so I assigned him to the investigation. At first, our results were inconclusive." "How so?" asked Krivax, suddenly very curious. "I began my investigation by approaching the Lordaeronian nobles with the closest ties to Stormwind, such as House Blackmore, Renea, and Whitehall," said Everdawn. "Without exception, they all claimed that they had simply considered Stormwind's dire situation to be unfounded rumors and that they did not consider looking any further into it." "Did you consider that they might have been manipulated by magic?" asked Krivax, voicing the obvious conclusion that they would have reached. "We did," said Everdawn. "It looked like such an obvious case of magical manipulation, that we were actually surprised by the arrogance of it all. It seemed as if they were not even interested in hiding their activities. However, when we decided to look into it further, it became clear that their arrogance was well warranted." At that, the half-elf's expression twisted into one of tired frustration before he continued, "No matter what tests we ran, we were utterly incapable of detecting any traces of magic having influenced these individuals. No matter how hard we tried, we failed to gather any evidence of foul play." Krivax was a bit surprised at that, but not completely. Deathwing was probably one of the most potent sources of void magic on Azeroth aside from the old gods themselves and the creatures that had been created by them directly, Thenraki. Krivax didn't know how skilled Deathwing was at actually using the old god's power, but he'd had plenty of time to train given how old he was. After joining the Order of Kalchit and studying the spell books that they had given him, Krivax had learned how insidious the void could be. The fact that Deathwing could manipulate the minds of Lordaeron's nobles without leaving any traces was surprising, but not overly so. "Then what has changed?" asked Krivax. "I don't think you would have called for this meeting if you didn't have any evidence to present. After our attempts to detect the magic affecting the nobles failed, I turned my efforts to more conventional methods," said Everdawn. "I began looking for signs of bribery, coercion, blackmail, and other more mundane means of persuasion. I figured that even if there was some kind of magic involved, it probably wasn't possible for them to mind control every noble in Lordaeron or there wouldn't be a need for subtlety in the first place." Krivax hummed non-committally. Deathwing was extremely powerful, but after some consideration, it did seem unlikely that the old dragon could just mind control every noble in the Eastern Kingdoms who happened to get in his way, right? If he could, then why wouldn't he just use the void to mind-whammy the governments of the Alliance and have the Horde roll over them without any difficulty? The most obvious explanation was that his power either had a limit or he was unwilling to risk being discovered by the other dragonflights. Given that there was still no sign of him doing so despite the letter that Krivax had sent to Crossus, it seemed more likely to be the former than the latter. Krivax couldn't really know for certain. Warcraft lore was filled with contradictions, so it was difficult to guess how those contradictions would fix themselves when translated into the real world. I did manage to find some evidence of bribes that were coming from somewhere in Alterac, but not enough for me to narrow down the potential suspects. The trail had simply gotten too cold. Until recently, Everdorn continued, his mouth turning up into a satisfied smile. After they began making efforts to turn public opinion against Azjol-Nerub, I was able to gather enough evidence to narrow down our potential suspects to the House of Raventholt and the House of Presta. Presta? Where have I heard that before? Krivax searched his mind in an attempt to remember where he had heard that name before. He had a strong feeling that it was incredibly important. Interestingly, House Presta is a relatively minor family with holdings in one of the most mountainous and obscure regions of Lordaeron, yet they spend gold well beyond their means, said Pathonia Shaw. Not only that, but despite Lord Presta being such a minor noble, he was able to marry his daughter, Katrana Presta, into one of Stormwind's most powerful noble families. Katrana Presta. That's the human name of Deathwing's daughter, Onyxia. While the name of Deathwing's human form was relatively obscure Warcraft lore, most fans of the franchise would recognize the name of Onyxia's human form. This meant that there was a good chance that Deathwing's human form was a noble from the Presta family, just like his daughter. What is the name of the current head of House Presta? Asked Krivax. Lord Davil Presta, Prince Varian immediately answered. Why do you ask? I wanted to know if I recognized the name, Krivax answered truthfully before changing the subject. Have you brought this evidence? I would like to see what you have managed to uncover. If these noble houses are indeed working against Azjol-Nerub, then that is something that I would like to know. Vizier Haedix and Anuba Khan would both want to know about this as well. Masrook nodded in agreement. Of course, said Pathonia Shaw, retrieving a stack of neatly organized documents from the desk and presenting them to him. What followed was a long explanation given by Everdorn of what they had uncovered, with Shaw offering her own contributions from time to time. Apparently, there were numerous instances in which House Presta had either bribed members of Lordaeron's nobility or instances in which Davil Presta had been seen interacting with nobles who changed their minds on some important matter shortly after meeting with him. One particular example of evidence was testimony from one of Lord Whitehall's maids, claiming that the nobles suddenly became skeptical of Stormwind's pleas immediately after meeting with Presta. A more recent example was a similar incident that occurred between Presta and Count Dalton. Aside from that, there were also signs that House Presta held a long-term business relationship with House Raventholt, who had long been rumored to hold connections to organized crime in Alterac. SI-7 had even managed to identify Lord Presta's closest servant, a goblin of all things, that went by the name of Krill, to be the one responsible for managing Presta's shady affairs. Krivax looked through the gathered information and couldn't help but feel conflicted. He really didn't want to antagonize Deathwing, he'd much prefer leaving him to be dealt with by someone more qualified, but this was too good of an opportunity to ignore. After sending his anonymous letter to Crossus, he had already upended the sequence of events that would have led to Deathwing's defeat at the hands of the other aspects. That being the case, it would probably be better for Krivax to do anything he could to ensure that the aspects found Deathwing and had the opportunity to defeat him. That wasn't something that he could do by staying uninvolved. We are aware that Azjol-Nerub is in negotiations with Alterac, said Prince Rin. We hope that you reconsider that in light of this information, as well as consider the offer that we made to you. That is not something that I can decide on my own, Krivax responded before changing the subject. How do you all expect Azjol-Nerub to help handle this matter? Also, why have you chosen not to present this to Lordaeron's House of Lords? Because we do not know how far this corruption has spread, said Prince Rin, slightly frustrated. And given that many of the parties that have been compromised are members of the House of Lords, we would need much more convincing evidence than what we currently have. As for what Azjol-Nerub has to offer, I was hoping you could answer that, Vizier Krivax. You are far more familiar with your kingdom's capabilities than I am. After a moment of consideration, Krivax decided that this was probably too important for him to decide on his own. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Prince Rin. Although I can't commit to anything right now, I intend to share this information with my superior as quickly as possible. I think that it's likely that you will receive a favorable response. That was probably an understatement. Krivax immediately thought of Hadix and the Order of Kalchit. They would not be pleased once they learned that a human noble from Ulturuk was using the Void to brainwash people against Azjol Nerub. I suppose things in Capital City aren't going to get any quieter anytime soon. Davil Presta, also known as Deathwing, listened to the mad goblin who he had taken on as a servant with annoyed exasperation from the comfort of House Presta's ancestral home. All goblins were mad, but this one was more so than most. The only reason that he put up with the creature was that Krill was undeniably competent in his role. Then Ravenholt and his cutthroats have agreed to our terms? My plans for Kultiras cannot continue without the aid of their assassins and saboteurs, Krill, said Lord Presta, interrupting the goblin. Of course, O Prince of Duplicity. Everything is going exactly according to your plans, Great One. Good, said Lord Presta, nodding in satisfaction. After his plans to capture Alex Strasser had failed, he had chosen to return to Capital City for a few different reasons, one of which was that there was simply little for him to do with the Horde that he couldn't do from afar. Being in Capital City allowed him the opportunity to search the minds of the human nobles for sensitive information that could be used against the Alliance. Not only that, but being exposed meant that he could afford to take actions that were much less subtle than he had been taking previously. One of those was leveraging the nascent void cult that was beginning to form among the Kultiran Tidesages to his advantage. Unfortunately, there were simply not many of them and they hadn't managed to grow as much as Lord Presta would have wished. Maybe in a decade or two, they would have been able to completely subvert the organization, but that was something that would never happen now. As it was, Lord Presta had been forced to hire mortal criminals to aid the cultists with the sabotage of the Alliance's fleet. It was fortunate that his daughter was so fond of playing her games of deception, and that she had spent so much time gathering resources and building up the Presta name. It made so much of what he had to do much easier. It was a shame that the rest of his children were not quite as useful as Onyxia. He had also gone to Capital City with hopes that he could discover how his plans had failed, but there had been little luck in that direction. Ravenholt had been able to discover that a goblin from the Steamweedle cartel had been hired to deliver a letter to Crossus, also known as Corialstras, but not much else. Despite the fact that Lord Presta had personally peeled the goblin's mind apart in search of information, he had not managed to find anything of significance. Oh, he was fairly certain that the Nerubians were somehow involved. The whispers coming from his masters had informed him of such, but there was little that Lord Presta could do about it in the short term. No, his revenge against the traitorous creatures would have to be a long-term endeavor. For now, he'd simply have to content himself with ruining any plans that Azjol Nerub might have of reaching an agreement with Ulturuk while also turning opinion against them. Although it didn't truly matter very much. After the Alliance and the Aspects were defeated, then there would be little that could stop him from collapsing the Nerubians' underground kingdom on top of their heads. After all, the Earth was his domain and nobody else's. I see the shadow of a smile on your face. Is someone about to die a horrible, grisly, bloody death, O venomous one? Spare me your nonsense, Krill, Lord Presta replied as he turned his attention back to the goblin. If you have nothing left of importance to report, then remove yourself from my sight. Presta tuned out the goblin's nonsensical words as it left his presence. There was much that he needed to do, but there was not much time before the Horde would be launching their invasion of Hillspread foothills, and Presta wished to witness the fruits of his labor. With a flex of will, Presta cast a scrying spell that allowed him to look through the void and watch the events that would soon unfold. He was curious to see the performance of the undead dragons that he had gifted to the Horde. As the aspect of the Earth, it was a trivial matter to find and retrieve long-dead dragon corpses and deliver them to the Horde, but Presta was not quite certain how well they would do when compared to a living dragon. Still, along with his other efforts, he was confident that the Horde would be able to make landfall and launch their invasion in earnest. With a wicked smile on his face, Davil Prestas sat back in his comfortable seat and prepared to watch the always amusing sight of mortals slaughtering each other. Admiral Dalen Proudmoore listened carefully from the quarterdeck of the Tide Mother's Vengeance as reports came in via the scrying crystal about the Horde's movements. Dalen didn't have much experience working with elves, but he supposed there was no reason to doubt their reports when both they and the scouts from the Second Fleet were telling him the same thing. The Horde was preparing to launch their invasion. From what Dalen could tell, it seemed as if they intended to disembark from the wetlands north of Kars Moden and land their troops in the Hillsbrad foothills, as Lothar predicted was their most likely landing point. To do this, they would need to successfully travel by sea across Barradon Bay, but Dalen had no intention of allowing them to travel uncontested. These creatures were from a different world, so Dalen couldn't blame them for believing that their plans might succeed. However, he would be more than glad to teach them why Kultiras was the most powerful naval force in the world, bar none. "What kind of composition can we expect from the Horde fleet, Fleet Admiral Seabane?" asked Dalen, consulting the leader of the Second Fleet. "Have there been any significant changes?" "No, Grand Admiral. The Horde's navy is still composed primarily of stolen human warships, goblin mercenaries, and many crude ore-powered ships," said the grim voice of Admiral Seabane through the scrying crystal. Only the orcs could use something as ridiculous as ore-powered ships, thought Dalen. Despite his derisive thoughts, he understood that the orcs had many troops that they needed to transport and not enough ships. Coupled with the freakish strength of the orcs, it was feasible that they might be able to row themselves across Barradon Bay. It galled Dalen to see well-made human ships under the control of monsters. Before its destruction, Stormwind had once possessed one of the most powerful navies in the Eastern Kingdoms. The majority of their ships had been used to transport the kingdom's refugees to Lordaeron, but many of them had unfortunately been captured by the Horde. It was unfortunate that Lothar had not had enough time to set them all ablaze, but Dalen could not blame the man. It was right for him to place the well-being of Stormwind's citizens above other matters. However, it was not these ships that caused the fleet admiral to sound so grim. According to everything they knew about the Horde, they were amateur sailors, a deficiency that well-made ships could not compensate for. No, what truly concerned Dalen and Fleet Admiral Seabane was the presence of the goblin mercenaries. Not because of the threat that they posed, although the goblins were no strangers to naval combat, but because of what their presence signified. Goblins were troublesome little creatures that often demonstrated a shocking lack of self-preservation if enough gold was involved. However, goblins were not fools, and there was still ultimately a limit to how much danger they would put themselves in. Given the vast superiority of the Alliance forces compared to theirs, Dalen had not expected that the goblins would be willing to stay and fight. That they were willing was worrying. If the goblins hadn't already run and taken their gold with them, then that meant they believed they had a chance of survival. "Do we have any idea what the bastards are planning?" Dalen growled out. "Perhaps the Steamweedle cartel has finally managed to arm their zeppelins?" offered his son, Captain Derek Proudmoore, commander of the Third Fleet, although his tone made it clear that he doubted that conclusion. "No, that isn't the case, Captain," Dalen said confidently. "Every spy in the Eastern Kingdoms has been keeping a close eye on the weapons coming out of their factories. Besides, one of the other cartels would have informed us. The only thing that you could trust a goblin for was their willingness to betray their own for a large enough bag of gold." "Then I have no idea what they could have planned, Grand Admiral," said Derek. "Neither do I. Attempting to divine the intentions of a goblin is an exercise in futility. Who knows what manner of ridiculous nonsense might come from their minds," said Seabane. Dalen was reminded of a particularly humiliating incident in which Kultiras lost a Stormbringer-class ship of the line that was undertaking anti-piracy operations near Blackwater Cove, or Booty Bay as the goblins preferred to call it. To this day, Kultiras still did not have a proper understanding of what happened, other than that the ship was destroyed by a massive gunpowder-based explosion that came from below. The greatest minds at the Proudmoore Naval Academy had come up with all kinds of implausible explanations, such as floating bombs being left in the water or ships that could swim under the sea. Ultimately, the only ones who knew what happened with any certainty were the Steamweedle cartel. With those thoughts in mind, Dalen turned his attention to the two people who stood by his side. "Are you certain your fellow Tidesages are prepared to handle any potential attacks from below, Tidesage Stormsong?" asked Dalen, directing his question to a man dressed in the usual brown and purple robes that were traditional to his order. The Order of the Tidesages was the most powerful religious organization in Kultiras, far exceeding the popularity of the Church of the Holy Light. The Tidesages held a variety of responsibilities, such as blessing the ships of the Kultiran navy, using their magic to provide favorable winds while out at sea, guiding their ships through dangerous storms, and much more. Not only that, but the Order of the Tidesages had even gone so far as to provide their own shrine Templar to aid the Kultiran military. Naturally, this meant that the Tidesage leader, Wayland Stormsong, was as venerated in Kultiras as Archbishop Fail was in the rest of the human kingdoms. "We are, Grand Admiral," said Tidesage Stormsong, his expression blank and his voice toneless. "Any members of the Horde which seek to attack our ships from below shall be swiftly sent to greet the Tide Mother." Although Dalen worshipped the Tide Mother like any other proper Kultiran, he could admit that the Tidesages were much less amiable than the priests of the church, especially in recent times. Dalen briefly turned his attention to the lad standing by Stormsong, who was apparently the man's apprentice. According to the report he had received from the Tirazian Secret Service, the lad was an orphan who had been taken to Stormsong Monastery by the Tidesages after he started hearing the whispers of the Tide Mother more clearly than most. Many of his fellow street children had described the lad as friendly and outgoing, but Dalen would have never guessed that to be the case looking into his eyes now. "I'm glad to hear that, Tidesage," said Dalen, forcing his attention back to the scrying crystal. "Fleet Admiral, where do you believe it best that we engage the Horde forces?" "Naturally, it will depend greatly upon the course they take, but we have a certain amount of freedom to choose where we attack them. In my opinion, our best bet would be to engage them near the island of Zul'Dare," said Seabane. "Not Crestfall?" Dalen asked curiously. He agreed, but he wanted to hear the Fleet Admiral's reasoning. "No, Grand Admiral. It's very likely that the goblins will be expecting an attack from Crestfall and will make efforts to avoid it." "I agree. The goblins will know that Crestfall is much more heavily populated and fortified than Zul'Dare," said Dalen. "The coastal formations near Zul'Dare are suitable for an ambush, as long as we utilize the magic of the Tidesages. Given the temperature of the water in Baradin Bay, it should take us little effort to summon a fog bank large enough to drastically reduce the Horde's visibility, Grand Admiral," said Tidesage Stormsong, immediately understanding his implication. "We should also be able to hold it as long as it is necessary." "Good," said Dalen, his tone one of satisfaction. The fleets would have little trouble navigating something as simple as a fog as long as they had the assistance of Tidesages. "If that is the case, then I propose that the first fleet should lay in wait near Zul'Dare, while the second and third fleets are held back in preparation. Once the Horde's ships finish passing by Zul'Dare, the first fleet shall engage them from the rear while the other two fleets move to quickly attack from the front." There was a lull in the conversation as the Fleet Admiral contemplated his plan before responding. "Are you certain that is wise, Grand Admiral? This plan would place your fleet in a vulnerable position if the Horde navy proves more formidable than anticipated," Seabane said evenly. "I agree, this plan sounds unnecessarily risky," said Derek, a note of worry in his voice. "Especially when we don't have a full understanding of the enemy's capabilities." Dalen took a moment to consider the Fleet Admiral's words. It was true that he would be in the most vulnerable position, while the second and third fleet would have the option to retreat back north in the direction of Hillspratt foothills. It would be much more difficult for the first fleet to do the same. However, Dalen had much more confidence in the capabilities of the first fleet given that they were composed entirely of ships from the Kultiran navy. The second and third fleets were composed of a combination of ships from the other human kingdoms, as well as a few elvish destroyers. Dalen had no doubt that the first fleet would be able to wreak havoc in the backlines of the Horde's navy while also relying on their extreme advantage in maneuverability to escape once they figured out whatever had the goblins feeling so confident. And if whatever surprise the Horde had waiting for them proved to be insufficient, then attacking the Horde navy from both the front and the rear meant there was a chance they strike a decisive blow against the Horde. Unfortunately, there was little chance that they would be able to actually end the war in a single battle due to the sheer amount of transport ships that the Horde possessed. They simply wouldn't be able to destroy them all before the Horde managed to make landfall. However, if there was a chance that Dalen could destroy a large portion of their forces, then he had every intention of doing so, even if it meant taking on a little risk. Dalen quickly explained his thinking to his subordinates and eventually received a reluctant agreement. "It is a risk," Dalen said after finishing his explanation. "But it is one worth taking." "Understood, Grand Admiral. The Second Fleet is prepared to set sail to the ambush location at any time." "Good," said Dalen, nodding in satisfaction. "If we are to succeed in this plan, then we must set sail for Zuldare immediately. The Tidesages need enough time to finish casting the ritual to summon the fog bank long before the Horde arrives, lest they grow suspicious due to its sudden appearance. Is the Third Fleet prepared as well, Captain Proudmoore?" There had been more than a little difficulty in integrating the various naval forces of the Eastern Kingdoms into a single fighting force in the form of the Third Fleet. Most of the other kingdoms were wise enough to mimic the naval structure of Kultiras to the best of their ability, but it was still exceedingly difficult to create a singular command structure and account for the capabilities of so many different varieties of ships. That was especially the case after Quel'Thalas sent their Elvish destroyers. However, Dalen trusted his son to get the job done. Derek was one of the most capable captains in the entire Kultiran Navy and had a good head for handling logistics. "Yes, Grand Admiral, the elves have been more cooperative than expected and their integration has gone well. The Third Fleet is ready to sail on your order," Derek said proudly. "Good lad." "Very well," Dalen said with a sense of finality. "Then the First Fleet shall set sail for Zuldare immediately and lay in wait for the Horde's ships to pass. Scrying shall be prohibited until the moment that the battle begins. We do not know fully what their foul magic is capable of and I'll not risk the chance that they might listen in on our conversations. Do the two of you understand your orders?" "Aye, Grand Admiral," said Fleet Admiral Seabane. "Aye, Grand Admiral," said Captain Proudmoore. "Good," said Dalen. "Then I call for this meeting to come to an end. May the Tide Mother be with you both." "May the Tide Mother be with you, Grand Admiral," repeated Derek and Seabane. Dalen turned his attention back to the deck of his ship and called out for his quartermaster as the scrying crystal lost its glowing luster. "Petty officer. Have the men raise the anchor. We set sail for Zuldare." "Aye, Captain." The petty officer saluted and immediately moved to carry out his orders. Soon enough, Dalen heard the sounds of running feet and sliding ropes as the men rushed to their assigned stations. He couldn't help but smile. Dalen had handpicked each and every sailor on his ship, and there was not a finer crew to sail the seas of Azeroth. Dalen turned his attention back to the sea beyond his ship and studied the waves in the sky. The seas were calm, and there were no signs of a storm approaching any time soon. Dalen was grateful for it. The Tide Mother had gifted him with such a beautiful day, so he would do everything he could to show his gratitude by delivering the Horde to her embrace. Nestled in the coastal formations of Zuldare, the crew of the Tide Mother's Vengeance waited patiently for their prey to appear. Her sails were furled so as to prevent her from moving and her anchor was dropped. The Tidesages on board had long since completed their ritual and a thick, unnatural fog bank spread for several miles from the island. High atop the ship, in the crow's nest, the lookout diligently scanned the horizons with his enchanted brass spyglass. The crew was visibly tense and worked with an eerie silence. It was approaching the time at which the Horde fleet was expected to arrive, and every man knew that their survival depended on the Horde not discovering them until it was too late. The crew continued to work in relative quiet until, eventually, a sharp whistle coming from the crow's nest broke the silence. Immediately, every sailor on the deck turned their attention to the lookout, only to see him pointing in a particular direction off the starboard bow. The ship's captain lifted his personal spyglass up to his eyes and looked off to the horizon, searching for the presence of their enemy. After a tense moment, the captain lowered his spyglass and barked a few short orders to his crew that sent them scrambling into positions. It didn't take long before every gun put on the Tide Mother's Vengeance's starboard side had been lowered and teams of men were in position to unfurl the sails and raise the anchors the moment they heard their captain's orders. Several Tidesages focused their efforts on thickening the fog that shrouded their fleet and several others prepared to cast the rituals that would allow them to summon a gale of wind once they needed it. Once everyone was in position, they waited patiently for their enemy to arrive and pass by their location. The crew received their first view of the enemy as a massive Tidebringer-class man-of-war lumbered past by them. Many of the crew bristled in indignation, fully aware that the ship was one that had once belonged to their people before being stolen by pirates and criminals. It was an insult they had every intention of paying back. Following behind the enemy flagship was a long line of tightly grouped warships, sailing in a formation designed to protect the numerous troop transport ships that followed behind them. If any of the crew still held any doubt over the threat that their enemy posed to their homes, those would have been dashed at that moment. Many of the crew watched as thousands of ships passed, carrying a veritable flood of orcs that threatened to sweep over the eastern kingdoms. Many of the sailors offered silent prayers to the Tide Mother, and several even prayed to the light. It was easy for them to lose track of time as the endless stream of ships passed them by, but eventually, they finally received orders from their captain. The last few ships in the passing fleet were Goblin warships, likely positioned at the rear to protect the transports from a potential attack from the rear. They would be the first to be destroyed. As soon as the last ship passed by the hiding fleet, three things happened in quick succession. First, the captain of the Tide Mother's Vengeance gave an order that sent his crew scrambling to unfurl the sails and raise the anchor, prompting the other ships in the first fleet to do the same. Next, a few of the tide sieges began to disperse the fog bank while the rest prepared to summon winds that would fill the sails of their fleet. And finally, the quiet was suddenly broken by the thunderous cacophony of an entire fleet unloading their cannons into the backline of the Horde navy. In a single moment of overwhelming cannon fire, several of the Horde's rear-positioned warships were splintered and destroyed, sinking immediately and littering the sea with corpses and flailing orcs. As soon as the last cannon had fired, Dalen Proudmoore yelled out an order that was heard by every sailor on the deck: "Raise the sails. Full speed ahead." It only took a few moments before the Tide Mother's Vengeance was leaping forward across the water as the sails unfurled and caught the wind. Dalen knew that his gunnery crew was already reloading the cannons and preparing to sink as many ships as they could. Target the surviving warships. Do not allow them to get their bearings. The Goblin warships made an admirable attempt to turn their guns to the first fleet, but their efforts were not quick enough to save many of them. A second volley of cannon fire broke apart several of the remaining warships before they could even hope to return fire. Dalen allowed himself a satisfied smile as the scent of expended gunpowder began to fill the air, happy to see his plans coming to fruition. "Captain. Incoming fire." Dalen turned his attention to one of the largest remaining Goblin warships, which was lining up its guns on his ship. A part of him wanted to scoff. It was likely that the Horde ship understood that they had little chance of victory, and the captain of the ship wished to aim its fire at their enemy's flagship. Unfortunately for them, the Tide Mother's Vengeance was the most powerful ship to ever sail the seas of Azeroth. Still, even if the ship wasn't under any great deal of threat, there was a chance that the ship could get a lucky shot and kill some of his crew. Take cover. Goblin munitions were perhaps the best in the world. The only ones who could even hope to compete with them were the gnomes, but they rarely created weapons. The goblins had deceptively good aim, and the ship was rocked as several cannonballs smashed into its side. However, Dalen knew that there would be little damage done. The Tide Mother's Vengeance had been constructed with superior Kul-Tiran timber, stormwood from the forests of the edges of Drustvar, and was heavily blessed by the tide sieges. Dalen focused his attention on steering the ship, confident that his men would soon destroy the rest of the enemy warships. His duty was to maintain a line of sight for the 40 broadside cannons currently firing at the enemy. "Grand Admiral, I have successfully managed to create a connection to the First and Second Fleets," said Tidesiege Stormsong from his position next to the scrying crystal. "Very good, Tidesiege," said Dalen, not taking his eyes off of the enemy battleship as he brought his ship into a firing position. "Fleet Admiral Seabane, Captain Proudmoore, the First Fleet has engaged the Horde. Are you nearly in position?" "The Second Fleet is nearly in position, Grand Admiral. You should be able to see us appearing over the horizon." Sure enough, Dalen could see the telltale sign of sails peeking over the horizon and approaching the Horde fleet. That explained why the Goblin warships at the front had not yet made any attempt to turn around and engage them. "The Third Fleet will arrive soon after, Grand Admiral. We've had to slow down a bit for the ships from Stromgarde." Dalen let out a snort of amusement. The only nation that had a worse navy than Stromgarde was the Alteraci, who didn't have one in the first place. Both the Second and Third Fleets had received orders to follow along the sides of the Horde navy and destroy as many ships as they could while keeping well out of boarding range. They were expecting the Horde to sail as quickly as they could to Hillsbrad foothills so that they could land their troops. While the Alliance navy could defeat the Horde at sea, Supreme Commander Lothar would have a lot more difficulty achieving a victory on land if they did not destroy a sizable portion of the transport ships. Despite the impression one might gain if one were to listen to one of the popular stories told by bards, naval battles were a long and grueling affair, even if one side held a decisive advantage. The second and third fleets were soon in cannon range of the Horde warships and were quick to engage them. The Horde was massively outgunned, but Dalen could tell even from where he was that the captain of the Goblin man-of-war was no novice. Damned, thieving goblins. After the first few volleys, the remaining Goblin warships were prepared to fight back, and destroying them became much more difficult. It took several hours, but the First Fleet was eventually able to diminish the enemy warships enough that they could focus their cannon fire on the transport ships. Each time one was destroyed, the men let out a cheer as hundreds or thousands of orcs were sent to their watery doom, their heavy armor weighing them down as they drowned, and Dalen couldn't help but feel satisfied. He had made certain to prepare for this and had stocked his fleet with as much ammunition as it could handle. And now that he had free rein against an enemy that could hardly fight back, Dalen had every intention of continuing until he ran out of ammo. And that was exactly what he did for a few more hours. If it were genuinely possible to do so, Dalen imagined he would have truly turned the Barradin Bay red with the blood of orcs. This continued until he spotted his lookout frantically attempting to signal him over the noise. Dalen immediately used his spyglass to look in the direction that his lookout was signaling, before spotting a sight that made him rapidly pale. At first, he had no idea what he was looking at when he spotted 3 flying undead creatures made entirely out of bone. However, once he spotted the eerie red glow emanating from the creatures as well as the Death Knights riding their backs, Dalen was finally able to understand. Somehow, the Horde had managed to find dead dragons and raise them into their service, and they were flying straight toward the Alliance fleet. Dalen forced himself to calm down as he quickly studied the creatures and considered his options. He could tell that each of the dragons was flying in the direction of one of the fleets, and it wouldn't be long before they arrived. This was not at all a threat that they were prepared to face. Dalen himself had not had much experience with dragons, but he had seen one fly when he was younger, and it was immediately obvious that these undead abominations were slower and likely less agile than their living counterparts. Still, it would be difficult to shoot down the creatures from such a low angle. The majority of their cannons were broadside cannons and were obviously incapable of hitting a target at such a high elevation. The only ones that might be able to do so were the cannons that were on the deck. "Captain, Fleet Admiral, there are 3 undead dragons approaching our fleets from the south," said Dalen, sounding far calmer than he actually was. His words were met with silence before Seabane responded with a skeptical tone. "I believe I misheard you, Grand Admiral. Please repeat." "There are Death Knights atop undead dragons approaching our fleets. Take up defensive formations immediately and move to regroup. We cannot afford to remain in our current positions with those dragons flying above us. Continue firing your broadside cannons at the Horde fleet and assign your best gunmen to the cannons on your deck." It was far too dangerous for their fleets to be spread out under these circumstances. They had already done great damage to the Horde, though not nearly as much as he wanted. Now they needed to act more defensively. There was another moment of silence during which the 2 men were presumably looking for the dragons through their spyglasses. After a while, both of them confirmed that they would be following his orders and Dalen turned his attention back to Tidesage Stormsong. "Tidesage, do you believe your gales will be able to have any effect on these creatures' ability to fly?" asked Dalen, desperate for a solution to the problem that was headed their way. "I believe so, Grand Admiral. Despite the fact that the creature's wings are made purely from bone and dark magic, the winds that I can summon at my full strength are extremely potent," said Stormsong, his full attention on the dragons. "Good," said Dalen, letting out a small sigh of relief. "Then do so, Tidesage." Stormsong nodded before tightening the grip that he held on his staff. "As you wish, Grand ADM." Dalen jumped back in shock as the Tidesage suddenly began choking and clawing at his throat. Just as Dalen was about to call for a healer, a strange black liquid began to leak from the Tidesage's orifices, and he soon started to vomit the same substance. Poison. But who could have possibly? He was barely quick enough to dodge the knife that Stormsong's apprentice had aimed for his heart. Dalen did not spend any time wondering more about the situation. He merely unsheathed Tidebringer from its sheath and removed the traitor's head from his body in one single motion. Dalen was about to turn back to check on Stormsong, but he was forced to stop and stare as the traitor's body suddenly began changing in front of his eyes. His skin turned from a healthy tan to a sick and eerie purple color, his fingers turned long and clawed, and the bottom portion of his decapitated head suddenly began growing tentacles. By the gods! What is this? Although Dalen was the furthest thing from a mage, he could tell that he was starting to feel more and more strange the longer he looked at the corpse. The feeling reminded him vaguely of his few encounters with shadow magic. Was the boy some kind of shadow cultist? Have the Tide Sages been compromised? No, at least not completely, otherwise, they wouldn't have had to poison Stormsong. Are the traitors working with the Horde? Dalen staggered as his attention was suddenly captured by one of the ships in the Second Fleet suddenly exploding in a burst of fire, followed suddenly by several other ships experiencing various explosions across all three fleets. Explosions? How? Wait. The other Tide Sages, there must be more traitors among the ships. Did they sabotage the gunpowder? Wait, they must have also gone after Derek. Dalen let out a short gasp of realization as he ignored his panicking crew and ran back to the scrying crystal. Derek. Be careful of the Tide Sages. One of them tried to stick a dagger in my heart and turned into some kind of abomination after I killed him. They tried something similar here, but I'm all right. I have a feeling many of our captains were not so fortunate. It will take some time before we can reorganize and fix our formations, said Derek, sounding a tad disturbed but otherwise unharmed. A similar message came through from Seabane and Dalen felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. That tension quickly returned as Dalen took an accounting of their fleet's current situation, only now could he understand the totality of the Horde's plan. The goal of the traitors was to assassinate their command structure in an attempt to disorientate their fleet. Several of the Horde transport ships had already turned around and were sailing toward them, likely with the intention to board them. Death Knights riding undead dragons were quickly approaching their locations, and would be working to both do as much damage as possible while also distracting them from the incoming transport ships. Once he understood, Dalen swiftly began barking orders that his crew move to obey without question. Deck-mounted cannons were aimed up at the incoming dragons while ships turned their broadsides to the transport ships. Nobody waited to receive an order to begin firing, and the sea was once again filled with the sounds of cannon fire. The broadsides proved accurate, but Dalen could tell that it wouldn't be enough. Many of the ships in the First Fleet were still sorting out their situations after the sabotage of the traitors, and the Horde ships simply numbered too many. The deck-mounted cannons proved more promising, with several near hits. One of the dragons took a hit to its front leg, but the undead creature failed to outwardly react. Dalen could tell that the one headed to his fleet was the most agile of the bunch, which meant the abomination managed to reach them before they could shoot it out of the sky. Dalen watched in horror as the creature opened its maw and released a stream of fire that lit one of his destroyers ablaze. It was too far for him to hear the screams of the crew, but Dalen felt as if he could hear them anyway. He wished that there was something that he could do, but he could only hope that one of his gunmen would hit their target on the creature's next approach. Dalen had confidence that they would be able to hit the dragon eventually, but how many ships would he lose before then? On the dragon's second sweep, it targeted one of the battleships. Every deck-mounted cannon in the fleet was trying to hit the blasted creature, but his men had little practice in hitting aerial targets, and this one was much swifter than the other two. The dragon flew down low again, and Dalen prepared himself to watch as another one of his ships was set ablaze. However, these worries proved unnecessary as a massive stream of water rose from the nearby ocean to meet the dragon's fiery breath. I'm glad to see not all of the Tide Sages have betrayed us. The Death Knight must have been surprised because the dragon failed to move as a cannonball struck its sides and shattered apart several of its ribs. Unfortunately, this was not enough to knock it out of the air as it simply kept on flying with a wound that would have likely downed a living dragon. Dalen clenched his teeth as the dragon turned around for its third attack, this time headed straight for the Tide Mother's vengeance. It must have realized now that the cannons posed an actual threat to it, and the Death Knight wished to destroy the Alliance flagship. Come then, bastard. As the dragon flew toward him, Dalen let out a quick prayer to the Tide Mother. His crew was the best in the world, and the dragon would have little room to dodge while it was coming straight at them. Dalen could feel his heart pounding as the gunmen barely missed their target, and the dragon opened its maw to reveal a bright fiery glow. When a cannonball coming from one of the other ships suddenly blew apart the creature's jaw, Dalen had never felt such pure relief. The Death Knight was obviously stunned and was unable to react quickly enough to prevent the dragon from crashing into the deck of Dalen's ship. However, he recovered quickly and one of the dragon's massive claws slammed down onto one of the gunners, and the Death Knight didn't hesitate to jump down from his mount and unsheath his blade. Humans. I am the harbinger of your death. I am Taran Gorthy. Dalen didn't wait for the abomination to finish talking as he drew his pistol from its holster and fired a shot aimed at the monster's heart. If his pistol was a normal one, he doubted it would have been powerful enough to penetrate the obviously enchanted armor the being was wearing. As it was, the bullet that was fired from the specially made enchanted gnome pistol managed to penetrate, but the monster merely laughed as if a hole in its chest was a mere inconvenience.